This episode contains graphic content that may not be suitable for all ages. Listener discretion is advised. If you or someone you know is struggling or in crisis, help is available. Call or text 988 or chat with someone at 988lifeline.org. Those outside of the US, reach out to someone at your local crisis center or hotline. Please do not suffer in silence. It was a Saturday afternoon in Brazil, August 20th, 1966. On the outskirts of Niterói, a city just across the bay from Rio de Janeiro, the sky was mostly clear, the air still heavy with the remnants of a recent rain. On Vintém Hill, where the overgrowth spills across the rocky slopes and kids often came to fly kites, a teenager was doing just that, guiding a paper kite through the breeze, watching it tug at the sky. He wasn't looking for anything unusual, but still, he found it. Partway up the hill, half hidden in the grass and brush, something stopped him in his tracks. What he saw looked at first like mannequins. Two figures lying side by side in the brush, almost too still to seem real. When he got closer, he realized they weren't mannequins at all. They were men. Dead men. Both of them were dressed strangely for the setting. Both were wearing formal suits, waterproof coats buttoned over top, and, most bizarrely, metallic-looking mask over their eyes. The kind of masks that did not belong to any recognizable uniform. Crude, hand-cut from thick sheet lead, shaped to fit the face like sunglasses without arms, but without openings. They were just there, still quiet, side by side, faces to the sky. The boy ran. He told his mother, who told the police. When authorities arrived later that evening, they found exactly what he had described. Two adult men, no signs of injury, no blood, no indication of a struggle, just a cryptic scene. 2 towels and a plastic packet, a small empty bottle of water, a notebook with a single handwritten note inside, barely a sentence, and, of course, the lead masks. Not visible or readily apparent were the names of the 2 men. Neither of them carried identification. Their cause of death was also not apparent. What authorities found at the scene was a puzzle, one that, nearly 60 years later, has still not been solved. This is the story of the lead mask case. In 1966, Niterói was a city in transition. Located just across the water from Rio de Janeiro, it stood on the eastern edge of Guanabara Bay, close enough to the county's cultural and political heart to feel its rhythms, but still distinct. Niterói had a quieter pace, known for its colonial charm, small industries, and the ferry that carried commuters back and forth from the capital. The city was steadily expanding. Neighborhoods pushed outward from the coastline, and hillside settlements dotted the steeper terrain. One such hill was Morro de Vintém Hill. Vintém was not a tourist destination. It wasn't even particularly well known outside of Niterói. The hill was rugged and overgrown, its lower slopes pressed against neighborhoods like São Gonçalo and Barreto. Despite being close to homes, the hill itself felt remote. Its vegetation was thick and wild, bushes tangled with tall grass, rock faces cutting through patches of trees. Steep in places and hard to navigate, it wasn't the kind of place most people wandered through without a reason. But kids went there sometimes, to climb, to play, or to fly kites. On the afternoon of August 20th, 1966, a young man named Jorge da Costa Alves, 18 years old, took his kite out to Vintém Hill. According to multiple reports, Jorge was a local resident who often came to the hill for recreation. On that day, the wind was favorable, and from the slope, he could get a better lift for his kite than down in the neighborhoods below. As he moved up the incline, following the string, Jorge saw something strange, 2 figures lying in the brush. He described them later as looking like mannequins. Lying parallel to each other, side by side, they were dressed in dark suits and long raincoats. From a distance, they might have seemed like discarded dummies, or scarecrows left behind in the grass. But when he got closer, the truth set in. Both of the strange figures were men, and both were dead. Georgia did not examine them closely. He saw enough to know that something was wrong. The setting itself was very unsettling. The grass around them was undisturbed. There was no sign of dragging, no sign of a fight. Just two men, laid out as if resting. Their faces were obscured by metallic masks. Dull gray, heavy-looking, shaped like wraparound sunglasses but without openings for the eyes. Both were made of lead. It looked surreal. So of course, Georgia did not stick around. He ran back to Sogonsolo, found his mother, and told her what he had seen. She contacted the authorities. The local police and later firefighters were dispatched to the area. It took time for them to locate the site again. The brush, after all, was dense, the hill's slopes uneven. But when they reached the location Georgia described, they found exactly what he had reported. Two men, no sign of a struggle, dressed identically in suits and raincoats, wearing lead masks over their eyes. And from the get-go, there were no immediate answers. By the time the authorities arrived on Vintém Hill, the sun had started to drop behind the haze of Guanabara Bay. It was still August 20th, the same day that Jorge da Costa Alves had made his discovery. But hours had passed since he had first ran home and alerted his mother. The delay was due in part to the terrain. Even though Vintém Hill wasn't far from populated neighborhoods, the location of the bodies was difficult to access. Police and firefighters had to navigate the hillside carefully, guided by George's description of the path he had taken. Eventually, they reached the clearing, and what they found matched his account. Two adult male bodies, both lying on their backs in tall grass. Each man was neatly dressed. Dark formal suits beneath waterproof raincoats. Their bodies showed no signs of violence. No blood, no wounds, no visible bruises or injuries. Their limbs were positioned naturally. Arms at their sides, their legs straight. There were no drag marks nearby, no sign of a struggle, no disturbed earth. It was as if they had both simply laid down and died. But the most striking detail, what seared itself into the minds of every responder, was the masks. Both men wore lead masks over their faces. Not full face coverings, but molded shapes that covered only the eyes and the bridge of the nose. There were no straps, no hinges. Just solid, hand-cut pieces of sheet lead, shaped like sunglasses without arms or lenses. The metal was thick and dull, clearly not mass-produced. It appeared to be homemade, perhaps from construction material or battery casings. Nearby, investigators noted three objects of interest. The first was an empty brown glass water bottle, of the kind used for mineral or medicinal water. It had no label. The second item was a clear plastic packet containing two small towels, still folded, clean, and unused. The third item was a small spiral-bound notebook with a plain cover. Inside, one page contained a short, handwritten message in Portuguese. It read as translated. 1630, be at the specified location. 1830, ingest capsules. After effect, protect metals, await signal, mask. The message was strange. Its phrasing disjointed, as if transcribed in haste or based on broken instructions. The mention of capsules suggested a planned ingestion. The reference to protect metals and signal mask puzzled investigators. Nothing in the immediate area suggested what kind of signal they were meant to await, or what the metals referenced might be. No pills or containers were found at the scene. As the officers examined the area, they noted how undisturbed it was. There were no cigarette butts, no food wrappers, no tools or personal effects, no weapons, no identification. The bodies did not seem to have been looted, but they also had not carried much of anything. Given the condition of the bodies, mild decomposition, slight bloating, some discoloration, it was estimated that the men had been dead for several days. Some reports suggested that they may have died on the evening of August 17th, possibly 3 days prior to their discovery. Recent rain may have slowed the decay, but it also complicated forensic analysis. Any trace evidence from the grass or the surrounding soil was likely washed away. No immediate cause of death could be determined. There were no injuries and no struggle, just 2 dead men, some mundane items, and lead mask. Nothing at the scene answered the obvious questions. In fact, everything found there only made those questions harder to answer. As soon as word got out, the story took hold of the public imagination. By the following day, local media in Niterói and Rio de Janeiro had picked up the case, and headlines across the region began asking the same question. Who were the men on the hill? And why were they wearing lead masks? Photographs circulated quickly. Grainy black and white images of the hilltop scene, the blank expressions of the victims, and most memorably, the crude metallic mask placed beside them. The press seized on the bizarre. There was no avoiding it. The story wasn't just about 2 unidentified bodies. It was about the strange, unsettling details that made no immediate sense. It was about the items. A water bottle, 2 towels, a pocket notebook with a cryptic message, and again, those lead masks. No one could explain those. The water bottle seemed ordinary enough, until people began asking why 2 grown men had carried just a single bottle between them. Was it medicinal? Did it hold something other than water? And why had it been emptied? The 2 towels also raised eyebrows. Folded, unused, packed carefully into a plastic bag. Was it a precaution? Part of a ritual? A sign of preparation? Then there was the note. Short, almost mechanical in its phrasing. Ingest capsules. Await signal. Protect metals. It read more like instructions than a personal entry. Many noticed the absence of emotion. It did not seem like a suicide note. It didn't read like a confession, and it didn't explain anything. The masks, however, drew the most attention, obviously. They became the visual centerpiece of the case. Shaped roughly like goggles or oversized sunglasses, the masks were molded from solid sheet lead and lacked any visible means of attachment. They were not something that one bought in a shop. They were also not theatrical props. They were functional in a way, purpose-built to block vision entirely. Some speculated that they were designed to protect the eyes from something intense, possibly radiation or light. The unusual nature of these items, paired with the condition of the bodies and the quiet of the scene, gave the case an almost otherworldly feel. It did not look like murder. It also did not look like suicide in the traditional sense. In fact, it didn't look like anything police had ever seen before. The public, meanwhile, began forming their own explanations. Speculation spread quickly, helped along by radio shows, tabloid papers, and word of mouth. Some believed that the men had taken part in a religious ritual. Others suggested that they had been attempting contact with extraterrestrials. A few thought it might have been a scientific experiment gone wrong, an attempt to channel energy, or light, or some unknown force. Others imagined a cult, or a pact. It wasn't long before journalists gave it a name, the lead mask case. And with that name came a sense of myth. The facts were strange enough, but it was the absence of answers that gave this story its grip, on investigators, on reporters, and on the public at large. Now, we're going to pause for a quick word from the sponsors that make this show possible. In the first few days following the discovery, police worked with urgency, but also with uncertainty. From the outset, the scene on Vintém Hill had presented more questions than it answered, and as the news spread, the pressure to identify the 2 bodies mounted quickly. Witnesses began coming forward. A local shopkeeper said she remembered selling waterproof coats to 2 men matching the victim's description. Another witness, a waitress at a bar or cafe near the bus station, recalled seeing 2 nervous men drinking soda and checking the time repeatedly. A bus driver said he might have transported 2 similar-looking men to Niterói on August 17th. While none of these accounts could be confirmed with certainty at first, they gave investigators a rough timeline to work with. They now believed that the men had arrived in the city 3 days before their bodies were found. But despite these leads, much remained unclear. The spiral-bound notebook recovered at the scene held only that brief cryptic message. There were no names, no addresses, no contact information. Police scoured it for handwriting samples or additional markings, but there was nothing else useful in its pages. Neither body carried any form of identification, no wallets, papers, or luggage. Whatever they had brought with them, if anything, was not left behind at the scene. The clothing they wore was of ordinary quality, not new but not ragged. There were no signs of drug paraphernalia, no containers for capsules, no personal items beyond the towels and bottle. After their recovery, the bodies were transported to the local morgue, but the damage had already been done. Between the rain and the delay in recovery, the process of decomposition had begun to interfere with any chance of immediate forensic analysis. Internal organs were softening, skin had started to bloat, insects had already found their way in, and at that time, forensic science in Brazil lacked some of the modern tools now considered routine. Even in optimal conditions, testing would have been limited. In this case, the possibility of obtaining clear toxicology results was diminishing by the hour. Meanwhile, Vintém Hill had not been secured. There was no perimeter established, no long-term restriction on access. In the absence of tight police control, the site quickly became a destination. Locals came out of curiosity. Journalists visited to take photos and measurements. Teenagers went looking for signs of a ritual or evidence of something stranger. Foot traffic disturbed the brush and scattered any minor clues that might have remained. Whatever had been left at the scene, if anything, was likely lost in the days that followed. Within the first 48 to 72 hours, police had very little to work with. They had 2 anonymous corpses, a set of unexplained objects, and a flood of rumors. There was no way to contact relatives because there was no idea where these men had come from. All they could do was hope that someone somewhere was missing them, and that a connection would surface. Until then, the case remained not only unsolved, but unidentified. In the absence of names, the investigation moved forward by examining the few physical clues left behind. Days had passed since the discovery on Vintém Hill, and while the public grew more captivated by the strange story, detectives on the ground were forced to work backward, starting with what the men had on them and where those items may have come from. Though the men carried no identification, a few receipts found in their pockets became key pieces of evidence. The first was from a local shop in Niterói. Investigators visited the location and were able to confirm that on August 17th, 3 days before their bodies were discovered, 2 men matching the victims' descriptions had come in and purchased 2 raincoats. The owner remembered the transaction, saying that the men looked agitated, not panicked, but nervous. One of them reportedly seemed preoccupied with the time. They paid in cash and did not linger. The second receipt led to a small pharmacy or grocery where the men had purchased the bottle of mineral water. The same bottle later found empty at the scene. Again, the shopkeeper recalled that the customers had seemed uneasy, watching the street outside as if they were expecting someone, or trying not to be seen. These encounters allowed authorities to begin assembling a basic timeline. At the very least, they could now confirm that the men were alive and moving through Niterói on the afternoon of August 17th. The trail, however, went cold after that. None of the shopkeepers knew who the men were. No one remembered them offering names or asking for directions. There was no record of them staying in a hotel or boarding house under their own names, if they stayed anywhere at all. They had left no impression beyond their anxious behavior and the handful of purchases they made. But for investigators, one thing was becoming increasingly clear. This was not the scene of a random crime. There were no signs of robbery, no forced ingestion, no indications that the men had been brought to Vintém Hill against their will. If anything, all the evidence pointed to the idea that they had come there intentionally, prepared for something and perhaps even expecting a specific outcome. They had raincoats, water, and folded towels. They carried no food, no extra clothing, and no money beyond what was needed for minor purchases. The presence of the notebook suggested planning. The masks, despite their crude appearance, had clearly been made in advance. Everything they brought with them, everything they wore, had a purpose. But what that purpose was remained elusive. Even by midweek, with pieces slowly coming together, the police did not know who the men were. They had not been reported missing and their families had not come forward. And without their names, there was no way to reach out. But the investigators had a growing suspicion. This was not an accident. Whatever happened on that hill was part of something larger, something the men had walked into willingly. The trouble was, nobody could explain what that something was. For nearly a week after the discovery on Vintém Hill, the identities of the two men remained a mystery. Their faces, captured in black and white newspaper photographs, stared blankly from the pages with the lead mask removed. The press called them the men on the hill and speculated on their purpose, but the basic question, who were they, had yet to be answered. It wasn't until days after their bodies were recovered that investigators caught a break. Photographs released to the media reached the city of Campos dos Goitacazes, about 280 kilometers northeast of Niterói. There, family members recognized the men almost immediately. Their names were Manuel Pereira de Cruz and Miguel José Viana. Both were in their early 30s, and both were electronic technicians. They had both left their homes just days earlier, telling their families that they were heading to Niterói to buy some equipment for work. And of course, neither had returned. With the identities confirmed, authorities in Niterói began expanding to reconstruct the men's final days, looking for every scrap of evidence that might explain how two seemingly ordinary technicians ended up dead on a hill, masked and surrounded by inexplicable objects. The two men left their hometown on August 17, 1966. They boarded a bus sometime that morning and arrived in Niterói in the early afternoon. They told their families that they were going to buy parts, materials for a business related to their electrical work, but their destination had not been a parts supplier, and no one ever saw them attempt to make such a purchase. Instead, investigators confirmed that they made a few unusual stops. First, they bought 2 waterproof raincoats from a local store. The shopkeeper remembered that transaction, not just because of what they purchased, but because of how they acted. He described them as nervous or on edge. They weren't talkative. One of the men, believed to be Miguel, repeatedly checked his watch. They left quickly. Then, they visited another shop and purchased a glass bottle of mineral water. The same bottle would later be found empty near their bodies. Again, their behavior was described as rushed and tense. They were also seen at a bar or restaurant nearby. A waitress recalled them ordering soda and sitting down briefly. She too noticed that they seemed preoccupied with time. One of them, possibly Manuel, looked out the window as if expecting someone. Police found a hotel ledger with their names written in it, showing that they had checked in that afternoon. But when staff went to their assigned room, it was untouched. The beds were still made. The towels were unused. They had checked in, but never stayed. The rest of their timeline is murky. There are no confirmed sightings of them between the afternoon of August 17th and the discovery of their bodies on the 20th. They made no phone calls. They left behind no additional notes. Surveillance as we know it today did not exist, and whatever trail they left was thin. What is known is that the men made their way, either by foot or vehicle, to Vintém Hill. They brought with them their raincoats, the bottle of water, 2 towels sealed in plastic, and their lead mask. If they took anything else, it was either removed or never found. To the police, the evidence pointed toward a planned outing. These men had not been dumped. They had not stumbled there by accident. They had come to the hill deliberately, with specific items and what appeared to be a schedule in the form of the handwritten note left behind with them. The phrasing of the note was strange, barely coherent, but it suggested preparation, a time, a set of actions, and some kind of signal or trigger. There was still no way to determine whether they had ingested anything. No pills or containers had been found at the scene. Even as their identities became known, their purpose remained elusive. Miguel and Manuel had arrived in Niterói under their own power. They moved through the city without leaving much of a trace. No one had seen them in distress. No one reported them missing until it was too late. They had told their families they were going to buy supplies. Instead, they went to a hill and died. More after the break. Once the men were identified, investigators returned to Vintém Hill to re-examine the site with fresh eyes. Now that they knew their names, Miguel José Viana and Manuel Pereira de Cruz, the focus shifted from who they were to why they had come there, and what had happened between their arrival in Niterói and their deaths on the hillside. The layout of the bodies struck investigators as deliberate. Both men were lying on their backs, side by side, their arms resting at their sides. There were no drag marks in the soil, no bruising to suggest that they had been moved or positioned after death. They weren't buried or concealed. If anything, they had chosen that place to simply lie down. It was also noted that the terrain did not yield much in the way of physical trace evidence. No tire tracks were tied conclusively to their arrival. No clear footprints, no discarded packaging, no signs of struggle. Aside from the natural wear of the hillside and the disturbance caused by recovery crews and curious locals, the scene appeared undisturbed. The items found near the bodies remained limited and strange. 2 waterproof raincoats, an empty brown glass bottle, believed to have once contained mineral water, a small plastic packet with 2 folded towels, a plain spiral-bound notebook, inside of which was a single handwritten note, brief, cryptic, and oddly structured, and of course the most memorable object, the lead masks. These masks were not industrial, they were handmade, cut roughly from sheet lead and shaped into crude eyepieces that resembled oversized sunglasses. Some investigators believed they were likely fashioned from automotive battery casings or recycled industrial materials. They had no visible fastenings. It appeared that the men had simply placed them over their eyes and let gravity keep them in place. Why they wore them remained a matter of speculation. One theory suggested that they were designed to protect against radiation. Another posited that the masks were meant to shield the eyes from a powerful light, perhaps a spiritual or extraterrestrial signal, as some believers in Spiritism proposed. Others argued that the masks were symbolic, part of a ritual involving altered states of consciousness. If the men had ingested hallucinogens, the mask could have served as a way to heighten inner visions while blocking out external stimuli. But these theories were mere guesses. The forensic evidence needed to support or disprove them was slipping away by the day. The autopsy took place after the bodies had already begun to decompose. The humid August weather, along with the natural delay in removing the corpses from the hill, meant that internal tissues had begun to break down by the time pathologists began their work. No physical trauma was detected, no external injuries, no bruises, lacerations, or marks to suggest foul play. But what puzzled investigators most was what they couldn't find: a cause of death. The one avenue left open to them, the possibility of poisoning or drug ingestion, was never fully pursued. A toxicological analysis, which could have revealed the presence of narcotics, sedatives, or other substances, was never completed. By the time officials considered the need for such testing, the relevant organs had deteriorated too much to yield viable samples. Whether this was due to oversight, a lack of urgency, or simple resource limitations remains unclear. At the time, Brazil's forensic laboratories lacked the funding and infrastructure needed for more advanced analyses, especially when dealing with decomposition. One pathologist noted that death may have been caused by the ingestion of an unknown substance, but without hard data, it was a tentative suggestion, little more than a footnote in an expanding list of possibilities. The note left at the scene, however, continued to haunt the case. 1630 be at the specified location. 1830 ingest capsules. After effect protect metals await signal mask. It sounds like a schedule, an instruction written in broken phrasing, but it was never explained. The reference to capsules implies premeditation. The reference to protect metals seems to correspond with the masks. Await signal, that part remained open to interpretation. Was that a religious sign? A light in the sky? A hallucination? Nothing about the scene gave it context. More frustrating still, no pills, pill bottles, or containers were ever found at the site. If the 2 men had ingested something, it had either been disposed of or had deteriorated beyond recognition. By the time the autopsies were completed, the most immediate evidence had slipped through investigators' fingers. The case was sliding toward mystery, not because it was complex, but because it had gone cold in the first crucial days. As recounted by Detective Inspector Jose Venancio Bittencourt, there was no medical reason within the ability of the state police lab to detect for the deaths. As the investigation into the deaths of Manuel Pereira de Cruz and Miguel Jose Viana stalled in Niterói, police shifted their focus to the men's hometown of Campos dos Goitacazes. They hoped that the answers to what happened on Vintém Hill might be found not in the physical evidence, but in the lives that the men had left behind. It did not take long to uncover something unusual. Both men were described by family and friends as well-regarded electronics technicians, skilled in their trade, quiet and intelligent, but there were also persistent rumors that they were involved in something beyond their day jobs. something spiritual, something experimental. Police discovered that the two had been active participants in a local spiritualist circle, sometimes described as a scientific spiritualist group. These circles were not uncommon in mid-20th century Brazil, blending elements of Spiritism, a belief system popularized by French educator Allan Kardec, with personal ritual. These groups sought communication with spiritual entities through unorthodox means. In some cases, their practices included the use of homemade electronic devices. The boundary between belief and science was often fluid. Witnesses told police that Miguel and Manuel had spoken before about attempting to contact spirits or beings from other dimensions. Some friends said that the pair were especially interested in the use of electromagnetic fields and lights as mediums for communication. There were even claims that they had constructed devices, rudimentary experimental machines, intended to amplify energy or tune into spiritual frequencies. No such devices were found on Vintém Hill, but the possibility that they had once existed, or that similar tools were used in prior attempts, could not be ruled out. One acquaintance claimed that the men had taken part in at least one earlier ritual where a signal was awaited, possibly linked to the wearing of protective masks. That ritual, they said, had been aborted before anything dangerous occurred. In this case, the theory emerged that Miguel and Manuel may have believed they were on the cusp of a breakthrough, that this was not a suicide but an experiment gone wrong, one step too far. Police entertained the idea, but no physical evidence supported it. No known society was officially tied to the deaths. No devices were recovered, and the surviving members of the spiritualist group, if they knew more, weren't saying much. With no suspects, no further leads, and no way to determine how the men had died, the case began to stall. By late 1966, investigators had reached the limits of what they could learn. Theories floated in the press and among the public, some of them plausible, others outlandish. Some believed it was a suicide, motivated by misguided belief. Others thought it was an accidental overdose of a homemade compound. A few believed it was murder, orchestrated by unknown figures who had led the men into a trap. There was even speculation that the case was a hoax that had somehow spiraled out of control, though to what end, no one could explain. With the mystery still hanging in the air, the Brazilian Justice Department made a final attempt to revive the case. In February of 1967, months after the men were buried, their bodies were exhumed for further analysis. It was too late. The embalming process, combined with the natural degradation of soft tissue over time, rendered any new forensic analysis ineffective. Toxicology testing was still impossible. The internal organs were too damaged to yield meaningful results. Even the original clothing had degraded in storage, limiting further examination of trace materials or residue. The case was formally closed with the cause of death listed as unknown. Public reaction was mixed, part intrigue, part frustration. Many saw the case as a symptom of broader problems within Brazil's forensic and investigative infrastructure. Others viewed it as a tragedy wrapped in mystery, unsolvable not because the clues weren't there, but because the opportunity to act on them had been lost. In a report issued later that year, investigators admitted that they had no firm conclusions. The lead masks, the note, the towels, the raincoats, none of it added up in a way that could be verified. They had no clear explanation for why the men died, nor why they believed it was necessary to prepare in the way they had. All that authorities had was the scene on the hill, and the story it left behind. To be continued on the next episode of Unresolved.